Good evening. I want to welcome all of you to this evening's lecture by Charles L. Davis II. My name is Erica Naginski. I teach here at the Graduate School of Design. And before I introduce this evening's speaker, let me offer a quick reminder about some features you'll see in this Zoom environment. First of all, the chat function has been disabled so that we all may focus on the presentation. Our speaker will respond to questions after he has finished the lecture. You, the audience, however, are welcome to send questions into the queue at any time during the lecture by clicking the Q&A button that you should find at the bottom center of your Zoom window. We will also have a live captioner providing captions during this event, and you can enable the captions by clicking the closed captioning button that's also at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin tonight's event, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. This is a quick reminder of what we have going on here. This Thursday, October 8th at 12 p.m., Edgar Petersy will discuss new kinds of city-based institutions in Africa that promote experimentation, learning, and testing. That's on Thursday. And on Tuesday, October 13th, we'll hear from Michael Maltzman, who will discuss his work with the Skid Row Housing Trust and what it suggests about the ways in which architecture and other design professions can help address problems of housing, affordability, and homelessness. He's also going to be joined by Mike Alvarez of the Skid Row Housing Trust and Helen Loyne of LA Mas. All these lectures will happen on Zoom. They require virtual attendees to register. And so if you need more information about these events, as well as on how to register, that information will be and is in fact available on the GSD's website. So without further ado, it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Charles L. Davis II. Professor Davis teaches architectural history and criticism at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Buffalo. He is an architectural historian who, quite frankly, is redefining our field. It's not simply that already at this early stage of the career, Professor Davis has a significant body of work. There are the articles in such journals as Architectural Research Quarterly, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Log, in which appears his remarkable essay, Blackness in Practice, Towards an Architectural Phenomenology of Blackness. There is also the volume, Race and Modern Architecture, which is co-edited with Mabel Wilson and Irene Chang, which, as the architectural critic and photographer Li Bei remarked, exposes, quote, how modern architectural discourse and thought have been influenced quite heavily by racism, and reveals how architecture and design have been silent partners in oppression, end of quote. There is the current research project on how Black artists have shaped and continue to shape the built environment from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. And finally, there is the groundbreaking book titled Building Character, The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style, which traces the racial charge of the theories of five moderns, Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, Gottfried Semper, Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and William Lescaze. All this has established the foundation of an uncompromising intellectual project, one that strives simultaneously for historical rigor and the elaboration of the terms of an anti-racist intellectual framework. One, in short, that promises to inject the historical and theoretical study of the design disciplines with energy and brilliance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Davis, whose lecture this evening is titled Canon Fodder, Debating the Racial Politics of Canonicity in Modern Architectural History.
Thank you, Erica, for that great introduction, very generous introduction. I'd also like to extend thanks to Mark and Andrew for sending me an invitation to come and to speak with you all this semester. I just wanted to offer a few opening words about what it is that we'll be talking about today, and how I'm going to approach the topic, just to kind of whet your appetite for what we're going to look at and to give you an orientation toward what it is that we're doing. But for me, the title of our talk today, Canon Fodder, debating the canonicity of race, the racial politics of canonicity in modern architectural style, is both descriptive, but it's also an invitation, a kind of prompt to develop an ethos for how one might approach the issue of canonicity in architectural history and architectural design. And in that sense, I'm really interested in both engaging in a debate with you all today, but also as we individually engage with the canon, to think about the ways that we debate its meaning, we debate its impacts and influence, and we also debate what form it should take for the future. And in that sense, I'm trying to respond to the challenge that was given to me when I was invited to speak here, which is to think about the text building character as a way of presenting certain strategies for rethinking the canon and what its potential is. And so I'm trying to present my material to you tonight in that way, both as a way of engaging in conversation and also perhaps moving the needle in terms of how it is that we think about the canon in our field and what productivities it should have. So with that, I'll get started with the presentation, and then hopefully we can have some discussion afterwards. So I'm going to show you this slide, which I use in most of my survey classes to open the semester. And this is a slide that is taken from an experiment I conduct with my students, where I ask them to go to the back of their textbook and to count the number of pages that are dedicated to each specific architect, and to create slides first of the works of architecture that are referenced, and then to add an image of the biography or the portrait of the architect that produced each design. And so when they do this, what's interesting is that students initially become very excited because they can see a formal variation in terms of the ways that architecture has seemed to change over time, both in terms of materiality and philosophical outlooks and prospects, even some of the signature forms that represent each period. But then when they look at the biographies of those who have produced these architectures, there's a sense of pause and disquiet, because there is a homogeneity there that is undeniable and problematic. And this exercise I always use both to open and close my semesters, opening with a sense of what currently exists, and then closing by asking my students to present a new collage of images that might change the way that we teach and think about the progression of ideas in architecture. I also show them this slide, which is one of the earliest images, particularly in the Second History Survey, where I show how architects of the 18th century begin to start to literally emulate the visible trappings of power and privilege as a way of trying to elevate themselves as artists, architects within the field. And when we look at, for example, the similarities between the royal blue, the diadem around the neck, the ways that the elements of culture and enlightenment and education are surrounding the architect, we get the sense that architecture from a very early time period has begun to reproduce the power structures for which it is created. And this sense of the reproduction of centers of power is something that I want my students to keep hold of as they move through both my survey course, but also to think about what kinds of precedents they're offered in studio, and even collectively, if we think at the institutional level, what types of buildings, what types of practices, what types of architects as figures, historical figures, does each place tend to emphasize? What patterns of power are being represented and reproduced at that level? And so this is just a sort of general way of giving you a sense of what I think are the racial politics of our discipline, which is that the aesthetic standards of architecture, even today, are still based almost exclusively on European definitions of art. Enlightenment definitions of architecture tend to stratify along the lines of intellectual and physical labor, with the architect being the intellectual power, the creative genius who manages the situation, who gets title and privilege for being author of a work. And then the physical labor is rendered invisible. In a place like the United States of America, these lines of individual and physical labor tend to still stratify themselves along racial and class divisions, which means that the power structures of those who have leisure and privilege tend to lean one way, and those who tend to labor under less edifying circumstances tend to lean another way. Yet this cultural bias remains invisible because we insist on labeling European standards of art universal principles of art. And in studios, when we teach the rules of form, space, and order, we teach it as if it is a universal language that can be applied in any context. And lastly, professional schools tend to use a whitewashed history of architecture to normalize this exclusive system of power. And so my project really tries to render visible the racial politics, not just in a general sense, but specifically the racial politics of whiteness in our field. And trying to, by rendering that visible, we can understand whiteness as an actual force, not just something that is normal or regular, but something that is a normative force that regulates how it is that we see the world, and then try to challenge what that whiteness means as we move through the profession. This is just a map that shows us, typically, if you were to divide the spaces within an architectural survey or canon, the spaces from which we tend to borrow the most impressive examples come from the global north, while the global south tends to remain invisible or only discussed in colonial terms, and that this narrative within architectural history follows a kind of global political narrative that is easy to trace. And then lastly, I want to sort of identify the fact that particularly when we speak about people of color, and primarily within the US context, African Americans, we tend to either discuss them in terms of vernacular architectural styles or in terms of sites of racism. And for a long time, we've relied on the presence of the Black body to tell us when race was operative in architecture. And when that body is missing, we tend to think that race isn't there, instead of understanding that it has been made invisible because the whiteness of our profession is not talked about as explicitly as the Blackness and the sites of Blackness that tend to emerge to show us where the social bottoms are or where the inequalities exist within our field. And so I offer you this slide just to encourage you to think beyond the abject spaces to which we tend to think about Blackness existing within our profession, to think about the ways that whiteness sets up the regimes of visibility through which we understand even what Blackness is and where it operates. And so those norms that we think of as also racialized, and then we can understand how race exists in every context within architectural survey of ideas. And so then if we take that sort of preamble and come to this book project, Building Character, the Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style, then I want to sort of walk you through the ways that I've tried to revisit the canon and to illuminate certain strategies of analysis that have allowed me to see the whiteness that is operative in our field, not just in terms of the immediate or incidental political contexts of these architects, but actually as an essential element of the ways that they think about form, and even the principles of formal development that they gain from thinking about the race idea scientifically, and then translating that into individual forms of national building styles or national material cultural traditions. And so, as you can see here from the table of contents, the volume is divided into two parts. I'll take you through the entire volume just generally, and then we'll focus on the contents of chapter 3, the search for an American architecture, to give you a sense of some of the strategies I've used to identify the whiteness within Sullivan's architectural discourse, but then conversely, to recover some of the contributions that Black audiences and Jewish audiences have brought to his particular notion of a democratic architecture or an American architecture, and what that means, or what that could mean rather, for the ways that we tend to look at architecture's general sense of its canon. So in this book, I'm really focusing on the paradigm of architectural organicism, or this philosophy of design that looks to nature to present the principles of making in architecture that emulate the ways that nature stylizes forms. And so in this discourse, where both the building and nature itself seem to be regulated by the universal principles of nature, architectural characters were consciously designed to mirror the racial and ethnic characters that were perceived to belong to certain national groups. And I'm really interested in the ways that these parallels start to ramp themselves up during periods of dramatic national change and heightened national or nativist sentiment. I'm going to take us through some examples that show us, in the United States at least, how the American transcendentalist philosophy of character and character building, as taught by figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, heavily influenced architects like Louis Sullivan, who was really interested in both writing himself into the tradition of American arts and letters as an Irish American, somebody who was a subject or an abject biography during that time period, when Anglo-American characteristics were thought to be predominant and most important. But then also the ways that he's thinking about the notions of physiognomy and the visual display of character from the realm of race and racial anthropology, and then applying that back to architecture itself, thinking of the building as having its own analogical sense of physiognomy, and what kinds of manipulations need to occur within that building fabric in order to represent and align itself with the racial characters of different contexts. So in order to start this research, I was really beginning to look for the conceptual parallels that exist between race and style in the biological and anthropological sciences, and trace the ways that this language, these notions of developmental evolution and character, found themselves and found their way into architectural discourses. And so using this notion of organicism and the principles of nature to regulate both forms, architects found ways of translating these ideas and exploiting the empirical parallels that seem to exist between race and style within the natural sciences to establish their own architectures. And so if we look back into the past, particularly when we look at the study of type categories, we'll find many different forms of natural phenomena categorized into types. On the far left, there's the categorization of natural species of plants. And this goes back to the Linnaean system of categorization, where before we understood the forms of reproduction and reproductive organs within plants themselves, we categorize them by their physical form and physical shapes. And so these elements then, visual appearance starts to take on greater importance. Then as we slowly progress with the writings of people like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and even Emmanuel Kant guiding the way, we transform this notion of physical taxonomy into something that we believed was generated from within the body itself, that an internal sense of form or an internal concept of what the form should become is what was regulating all of these variations that we found in nature. And so in this middle diagram, we see different peoples from countries all around the world, categorized not only by their racial types, but then given certain elements to help us to understand their cultural habits and the ways that culture emanates from both the geographies that they lived in and the racial typologies they produced. And similarly, architects would establish and create typological categories for the vernacular styles that they would then trace back to antique man in various ages and stages of the past. This one I think is a really interesting diagram because it tries to show us through just zooming into the individual species found in each geography, what each geography offers. And this was a diagram that was created by people who believed that perhaps the human variations or the human races that we see in the world might be evidence of entirely different species, which would explain the intellectual characters and potentials of different groups of people. So at the very top, what we have then are the racial profiles of man and the different animals that propagate in each region of the world. But underneath that, we also get a sense of the interior structure that makes man have the appearance and the characteristics that they have on the outside. So the sense that some structure within is actually being expressed with the physical changes on the outside is something that would find its way into architecture. And we can understand this in a very simple way by thinking about the sensibilities through which we talk about the structure and the cladding or the outside elements of an architectural building as being the skin and the bones of a building. And Viollet-le-Duc was someone who was very good at sort of exploiting this analogy, thinking about his buildings as something that one could reconstruct from very small parts, particularly the structure of the building, to understand the logic of its overall form. And so I look at this time period in modern architectural ideas when Vitruvianism is sort of on the decline, and we're looking for new models of nature to understand how to create architectural styles. And so the human body metaphor that is implicit in Vitruvian theory starts to become transformed and empirically rationalized. And in my reading, this rationalization leads to the projection of certain racial characters in the architectural forms that are being created. And if we go back and we think about what the model of Vitruvian man represented, there's a sense of a kind of divine and divinely ordered clockwork that guarantees the proportions and the notion of congenitas that exists within Vitruvian architecture, that the harmonies geometrically that we find between the small part and the large whole is something that is happening at a kind of metahuman metaphysical level through the divine. But when the notion of man shifts from one of divine origins to one of natural origins, and the variations that occur within the world through different races of mankind is now being driven by things like geography, climate, diet, migration. Now we start to see the language of architectural forms themselves and our understanding of what Vitruvianism can offer start to shift. So Claude Perrault, a doctor who also worked as an architect in the École des Beaux-Arts, talks about these different species of columns, 5 species of columns, following the methods of the ancients. And we see this language start to shift as we understand what relationship potential exists between a scientifically rationalized understanding of man and a scientifically rationalized process of design. And so I'm really interested in the ways that beyond just a general natural metaphor and beyond a general anthropological understanding of form, the ways that race and race theory specifically offered a very useful heuristic tool for the architect to think about how to shape forms that would fit their context. Notions of regionalism and indigeneity emerging from this notion and study of race science. And so I'm really trying to pinpoint the ways that these conceptual parallels resulted in a now stabilized set of design strategies that would abstract the natural principles of universal orders, and then literally personify the behavior of buildings so that they could have characteristics that would mirror the racial and ethnic characters that were perceived to exist within national groups. In one sense, this is shown by the notion of the formal evolution of a building to adjust itself to fit the form and programs that it is meant to house. The other is by categorizing different typologies throughout time as if they were found specimens in nature. And through this kind of logic, we start to see the transformation of these elements in architectural discourse. And so I'm going to show you a few of the human body metaphors that I've tried to trace in this work, first starting in Western Europe and then moving to the United States. Part one of the book looks at the Aryan character of Alpine architectures, really looking at the work of French structural rationalists and German tectonic theorists, particularly for the ways that they trace notions of contemporary national development back to primitive architectural forms found within the Alpine mountain ranges. So in the French case for Viollet-le-Duc, this related back to his notion and study of the Swiss chalet form. And for Gottfried Semper in the German tectonic theory tradition, this dated back to some of the so-called preserved housing typologies that existed within the mountain ranges that he and Leo von Klenze claimed preserved these ideas from the antique past to the present. And so the central notion of race that animates these theories is Aryan migration theory, or this notion that primitive Indo-European men and women started in the Caucasus Mountains, and as they came down into the plains below and migrated, some to the Indian subcontinent, others back into Western Europe, they spread throughout the world. And this theory was first substantiated by the organic analysis of language systems and the location of mother tongues and sister tongues in a kind of analogical notion of sexual reproduction and family lineage, spreading from the Indo-European language to the different languages of Western Europe and India. And then later, this abstract notion of language would then be formalized with the introduction of actual racial traits. And so following the dynamics of this theory, geographical migrations, and the understanding of evolution organically through this kind of linguistic and biological metaphor, I look in chapter one at the ways that Viollet-le-Duc revives an Aryan hut from the past, finding a kind of historical root in the Swiss chalet form that fell along the current boundary, at least during his time period, the current boundary between France and Switzerland, and then adjusting that form to literally accommodate him as, in his mind, as he thought of himself as a modern day Aryan, to be modernized and to revive the racial characters that were lost to the past into the present. And then with Gottfried Semper, I'm really interested in the ways that his study of the tectonic origins of German character, particularly at this political moment when Germany is starting to debate the terms of unification between the North and the South, and the multiple languages and the multiple principalities that existed. I read Semper's study of the tectonic origins of German character as his way of literally designing himself out of that problem, finding a common root for the diversity of the contemporary moment back to the remote past, and then reviving that sense of characteristic for the present in a kind of prototypical modernist style that could relate to any of the cultures that existed during that time period. Part two then looks at the dissemination of these ideas from Western Europe over into the United States, literally looking at the beginning and the founding of the United States as a settler colony establishing a new European narrative for the origin myths of the country, and then creating a synthetic notion of how it is that European ideas and European customs were transformed first into a new native form of culture through the material culture of white settlers, pilgrims, and those who were settling the so-called virgin landscape, which then erased the memories of Native Americans and those who came, who were here before European settlers, as well as suppressing the memory and material culture of the non-white peoples who were brought to the US in the wake of European settlership. And then the imagined evolution of this new primitive native style into the modernist styles in the United States. And I'm looking particularly at those who were situated in the Midwest, people like Sullivan, or trained in the Midwest, in that Midwest sensibility, people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who thought of the Midwest as being the heartland of America and offering something that was unique from the European revivalist styles that were occurring on the East Coast, that was uniquely American, both vernacular to the place and also modern to the time period. And so within this appellation, then, my critique is that I'm really trying to isolate and then push back against the exclusively white definitions of national character that defined who was American and whose character was most central to how it is that we understood what American architecture was. Chapter 3 looks at Louis Sullivan and his training and translations of physiognomic ideas in the arts into a new form of American architecture, which he believed was the foundation for a democratic common culture in the US. And then I look at the afterlives of the 3 chapters before and the explicit architectural organicism of this kind of national architectural style movements into some of the organic underpinnings of the international style. Chapter 4, when public housing was white, looking at the ways that William Lescaze, who was one of the few architects who practiced in the United States, to be featured in the 1932 International Style exhibit, and look at the ways that he takes the formal idiom put forward in that exhibit and Americanizes it for the use of public housing. And I go back to a time in the late 1930s when the federal government is first financing these projects, and we're starting to see not the image that we might expect today, which is warehouses for low-income people of color. But instead, we're looking at the newly modern and brand new context to help with the social mobility of white ethnic immigrants coming into the US who are working class and need to become middle class white Americans, as well as those who were identified as the submerged middle classes who came into the US, or who are already rather in the US, but still suffering from the Depression years. And so this architecture being explicitly used by the segregationist policies of federal and state housing authorities to segregate and primarily house white and black audiences turns this Americanized international style into an emblem of white uplift and white social uplift and character in the US in the 1930s and 40s. So if we just take that as a general arc of the book, I want to return to chapter 3's discussion and now talk about the strategies by which one can re-engage with the canon by thinking of it as a kind of debate of ideas and limits, and trying to both look at the frailties of our current conception of what the canon is, and then expand that itself. So I'm trying to now do battle with the traditional narrative of how we understand Louis Sullivan. From one side, this is the kind of extremely rationalized, technologically rationalized notion of form follows function that the modernists invented in the wake of Sullivan. Also trying to nuance the revisionist narrative that we recovered since the 1970s of Sullivan's architecture being a kind of poetry of form, a way that he seeks to lyricize some of the natural and organic elements of the American Midwest into a style that's representative of this new stage of promise in the United States. And I particularly look at the building that's shown on your right to do this kind of analysis, which is a synagogue turned into a Baptist church that was located on the south side of Chicago. Originally designed for the Reformed Jewish congregation, Kahilath Anshe Ma'ariv, and then later purchased and transformed into a Black Baptist church, Pilgrim Baptist Church. And in my reading of this building, both Sullivan's, at the time period, what he considered anyway from his own perspective, Sullivan's compromised design for the Jewish congregation, in my mind, actually established a kind of new architectural aesthetic that actually acknowledged the hyphenated identity of Jewish Americans, instead of truncating them underneath a kind of assimilated symbol for American identity, much in the ways that Sullivan would have done for other civic monuments and groups. And in that sense, bringing and pushing his architectural idiom forward beyond the very limited conception that he had. And then later, with the changes both spatially and artistically and aesthetically within the interior space that the Black congregation introduces, I'm arguing that there's a gradual pushing of Sullivan's initial vision, which is very negative towards first-generation immigrants and towards people of color, into a space that is truly an American architecture, not the limited vision that he established in his lifetime. And doing so then allows me to look at and compare the ways that racial embodiment of different groups in a space, and the ways that they understand and construct their racial identity through spatial practices, allows us to really reinterpret the physical structure or the frame around which these practices were conducted in the form of this architecture. And therefore, debating the limits of where the architecture ends and the spatial practices begin, and the reciprocity between these two practices that we can recover over time if we look with a critical eye. So I'll just sort of very briefly try and review these different canonical interpretations of Sullivan. Usually people cite this text where they get this phrase, form follows function, and depending on how one will interpret it, you might think of his building as a kind of aesthetic frame for the structural frame underneath, where all of the lines of force moving from the facade of the building show us in a phenomenal way what is happening behind the building, even so far as trying to show what the utilitarian frame of the building would be without the explanatory tectonic frame that tells us artistically what these forces are. And then there was the recovery of his work, Architecture as Poetry, which really tries to reinvest in Sullivan's inspiration from the American Transcendentalists and the poetic tradition, as well as thinking about the ways that he's reformulating this notion of natural forms, organic forms, into something that is purely completed from the mind of the artists themselves, and therefore representative of American creative capacities, not just an imitation of nature in a kind of strict mimetic sense. And so these diagrams at the top that are showing you Sullivan's ability to geometrically construct lifelike botanical forms, but then abandoning that for something that is much more dense and floral in terms of being a self-referential system, one that seems to explode the potential that he believes comes within the geometry itself. We now get a kind of ahistorical, non-mimetic, botanical form that is floral-like, but representative of his pure creativity. And in his mind, this pure creativity would carry the index of his Americanness and what made him American. And so in this kind of block here, we can see sort of the denuded forms on the left and the floral forms on the right, kind of showing what I describe in the book as a kind of recontextualization of American technology, in a way that indexes the organic material, raw material, that Americans would become stewards of and would need to exploit properly in order to build their wealth in the West, bringing some of those floral references into the city so that when you look at a transect through this section of the city, from the urban to the suburban to the rural and the wooded areas, you can see where some of the elements fold one into the other. So the mechanical tools rather that were used to aggregate and to create these agrarian spaces in the countryside, bringing the machine into the organic and mechanizing that space, has a kind of inverse and a balance with the floral botanical ornamentation of the technological frame itself, showing the codependency of these forms in space. And so this interpretation really brings back this notion of form ever follows function as a kind of botanical and even biological reference, and the ways that these notions of growth and development from the organic sense come back into the building. And we see some of that in these readings, looking at the new forms of floral ornament that's produced, again, onto the utilitarian building to ennoble it in this sense of being a Midwestern architecture. And at least for Sullivan, the crest, or at the very limits of the wave of Western civilization as it was moving across the Atlantic and into the US, across the Midwest. And so even looking at these two, I'm looking for a gap in those literatures to identify the ways that race and race thinking was really key in this. And one of the texts that led the way here in this sense is Joanna Merwood's essay, Western Architecture, Regionalism and Race in the Inland Architect, where she identifies the racial politics of frontier imagery and ideology, and the ways that the frontier was reimagined as a space for what I'm calling a new white Adam, a new kind of native subject. And that it is within these architectures that the racial idea of a new primitive origin point for America starts to take shape. And so using that lens and developing it, I'm looking at the ways then that Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays on character and Walt Whitman's poetry, particularly Leaves of Grass, which Sullivan owned and was very inspired by, introduced a new way of thinking about what an American architecture could be, not just a straightforward imitation or revival of European styles, but something quite unique. And in Emerson's book, English Traits, what's interesting is that he draws a narrative that takes us from the Anglo-Saxon tribes of England and Europe and shows us how the transatlantic migration into the US creates a new virile form of Anglo-American identity that will be the root of national culture in the United States. And Walt Whitman, in some of his poetry, where he even creates a sense of literary blackface, imagining himself to be a black subject. In his writings, he has a kind of positive sense of where Black Americans might be in America. But then when we look at his speeches and we look at his popular writings and his own politics, his racial politics, we see that this comes down into a kind of pessimism about where Blacks would fit in this new Anglo-American culture. And this is a quote from an op-ed he wrote for the Brooklyn Daily Times in 1858. It says, "Who believes that the whites and blacks can ever amalgamate in America? Or who wishes it to happen? Nature has set an impassable seal against it. Besides, is not America for the whites? And is it not better so? As long as the blacks remain here, how can they become anything like an independent and heroic race? There is no chance for it." It's just a chance. And so this sense that American character would be defined by the Anglo-American roots of culture, and that the natural limits on those who could not assimilate into that cultural space would eliminate or eject those peoples into other areas of production. And remember, in architecture, I talked about the division between the intellectual labor that would lead the charge of American arts and letters, and the physical labor that would be used to support it. And all you have to do is think back to a lot of the WPA sculpture works and paintings to get a sense of how African Americans are treated as primarily the laborers within America, but not as a creative force within America. So this idea starts to take form through the doctrine of manifest destiny, through the notion of an Anglo-American character that will lead the way. And so this not only has an effect on non-white peoples, as I'm mentioning here, but also upon people like Sullivan, who could pejoratively be identified as an Irish American, and the Irish, in comparison to the English, or the English sensibility and character, is derided for being unable to assimilate into this space. And so Sullivan would start to think to himself, both first pictorially by picking up certain drawing and drafting practices, and then later, by the time he writes his autobiography, in a very explicit way, trying to write himself out of the Irish tradition into the Anglo-American tradition as a kind of exceptional hybrid or amalgamated American whose French and German Swiss heritage outweighs the negative elements of his Irish heritage. And you can see some evidence of his beginnings of understanding character through visual pictorial means in character studies like this one shown here. We have a landscape and the social typologies that emerge within a place side by side one another, and the proliferation of not individuals as such, but a kind of abstracted, almost caricature-like description of the types of people you are likely to meet. The gossiping old woman, the degenerate wealthy male. You can see those types start to emerge in this bottom half. And I'm reading then this as a prelude to him understanding similar type forms emerging within the American landscape and geography through its architecture. Now, when we read Sullivan's text, we see the principle of physiognomy applying itself and projecting itself across both organic and inorganic elements, natural elements and architectural, or even sort of glacial and geographical elements in the world. One example can be found in Kindergarten Chats, where he says, "From the character of a peer, may we not discern the character of a race? And from the slowly changing character of a developed peer, may we not discern the temperamental changes taking place in a race, its growth, its fulfillment, its decay." And in this quote, we get the sense that Sullivan believes that there's a kind of ability to analogically read in one form that is resulting from cultural productions the characteristics that are embedded in another form. In this case, literally either the character of a peer and the character of a race, or the artist and the artwork having a kind of endemic relationship between one another. We see this being used in literal racial profiling of certain figures in his autobiography of an idea. Here is where he describes his father. He says, "It seems strange at first glance that these highly virile and sensitive powers should be embodied in one so unlovely a person. His medium size, his too sloping shoulders, his excessively Irish face, his small repulsive eyes, the eyes of a pig, of nondescript color and no flash, sunk into his head under rough brows." And so here he's sort of describing his first generation immigrant father, who was Irish, in one sense to sort of repeat the stereotype of the pig-eyed Irishman, the low-level, low-class immigrant who is forced to sleep with cattle, the layabout, all the different stereotypes of the time period. But in another way, to distinguish his father, who was a first-generation Irish immigrant, from himself, who, being born in America, he argues, makes him more American, and thus not emulating the characteristics of the old world, but synthesizing the characteristics of the new world. And he would look to his mother as the way of really starting to push forward this characterization. As to the mother, Adrienne Liss Sullivan, she seemed French, but was not wholly so. She had the typical eyelids, expressive hazel eyes, and oval face, features mobile. She was of medium stature, trimly built, highly emotional, and given to ecstasies of speech. And what's interesting is that in Sullivan's library, he contained several illustrated volumes of physiognomy, and they described different types of eye, nose, and mouth configurations. The same kinds of eye, nose, and mouth configurations he would use to describe his father and his mother, as well as his business partner. Here's a passage where he describes the Jewish characteristics of Denkmar Adler, his business partner, in the Autobiography of an Idea. And here again is that parallel between some of the stereotypical features, the heavy set nose of the Jewish person, and the ways that physiognomically helps one to read the inside of the character. And so I take this early exposure to physiognomy and try to understand how he translates this into a theory of architectural physiognomy. And in the case of the synagogue, and here you're looking on the left at the initial design for the building, I'm really looking at the ways that he emulates H.H. Richardson's notion of an urban architectural style, full of crisp lines that are appropriate to the really densely packed lot lines in the city, and the ways that the profile itself starts to suggest a kind of highly regulated urban sphere, and an architecture made for this urban sphere. And in this design, this initial Richardsonian design, I'm looking at the ways that in that top diagram, we're looking at the Worms Synagogue, the synagogue that was constructed in Worms, which takes on a very anonymous characteristic at this time period. And this happens during periods of oppression when the Jewish congregation doesn't feel safe showing visibly the kind of Orientalized or Saracenic architectural characteristics that would identify them as Jewish. They take on a very anonymous form. And taking examples like this in the Reformed Jewish tradition, and then combining it with the very secular language of Richardson, we get a kind of assimilated form that shows us what the civic characteristics of religious spaces would be in Sullivan's ideal. And he would write about churches as sort of remnants of old feudal European societies that would secularize and shed themselves of their ecclesiastical characteristics as they come of age in the West, or he was talking about the Midwest. And so his vision of what the synagogue should become was one of a kind of secular meeting space where the philosophical underpinnings and tendencies of the Reformed Jewish congregation would become the dominant aspect of who they would be in the United States. And here's a couple of slides just to give you a sense of the organization internal to the building. We're on the base floor. As you enter the steps on the first floor, you have the communal and civic spaces on that that first floor level, and then you go up a set of steps to a higher level where the congregation is situated. So in a sense, elevating the sacred from the level of the profane, but using the two to complementary program sets to advance the mission of Reformed Judaism in the States. And on the left is an illustration of this interior that Sullivan drew up before the building was completed. And the feature that I want you to focus on is really the back wall, where the opening for the stage is integrated into a kind of wall system that stretches over several layers into the clerestory layer. And behind the screen was the organ of the building. So when the organ played, it was almost as if the building itself was breathing the music into the space. In the sense that there's a kind of organic synthesis, that this space is almost living and breathing, with the floriated ornament all around, integrating the banding at the top with the structural bands across, and then the close tying of the organ space here with the stage, and then here on either side would be a space for where the chorus could stand to speak to the audience. And I'm showing you two different examples of this motif. Now, for many reasons, this initial design did not come to fruition. Instead, what happened is the bottom layer took on this kind of secular characteristic that you could trace back to Richardson. But the top layer started to develop ornamentation that was much more expressive of the ecclesiastic vision inside of the building. And many people from Montgomery Choulier to others would critique this building for not quite being organic in the sense that Sullivan strove for, as a kind of synthetic form that had the same kind of visual characteristics throughout the building. But when you compare this top layer to certain explicit elements within the Reformed Jewish tradition, you can see some of the features mapping themselves back onto this form. And for me, this is a really interesting moment of schism in Sullivan's research, where we have a sense, let me go back for 1 second, a sense that the Jewishness and the Americanness of this congregation is expressed simultaneously. And so I look at this as an example of a hyphenated architectural form that exceeds the secular limits of Sullivan's design for this congregation, but in a sense, by exceeding that limit, expressing something that is more uniquely American, more pluralistic than he would have imagined himself. When we go to now the time period when the Black congregation takes over this space, what I find is interesting is that this building speaks to them in several different ways. So there are quotes in local Black newspapers that one of the first things that they wanted to put in this building was a new normal school, patterned after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee University. And this brings us back to Washington's discussion about architecture in his own space, which he records in a collection of speeches in a book called Character Building, which talks about the ways that African Americans can literally design a material culture that is expressive of what their contributions to American society should be. And he talks about this kind of secular, very modest masonry type of architecture that would fit and align very well with Sullivan's original notion for this building. So the first plan was to turn this into a kind of technical school for African Americans to build their way up into social uplift through this sense of bootstrap ideology. When that fell through, the Black Baptist congregation, Pilgrim Baptist Church, purchased the building at a discount from the Jewish congregation and then established themselves. And I look at the ways that from the 1930s to the 1970s, the space of that screen, that diaphanous screen where the choral notes from the building sort of sang into the interior, starts to change as the congregation finds itself at home. One thing that happens is that the organ and the chorus are relocated. So this wall no longer speaks in the way that it used to speak. But then in addition, we find that the retinue of characters around the clergyman itself starts to take on greater and greater form, especially as we move into the origins of gospel music and the birth of gospel music in this building. And so as the congregation starts to identify the elements of material character that are exclusive and characteristic of themselves as a racial and cultural group, we start to see artworks like the one on your right, which show multiracial depictions of different moments in the Bible. Here we're seeing Jesus surrounded by people of different hues to show that African Americans are literally trying to project themselves and inject themselves into the past, the canonical past in this biblical sense. And interestingly enough, over time, as the building ages, the top portion of the clerestory on the exterior starts to, as it falls into disrepair, is not repaired and restored in the ways that would preserve the Jewish imagery that was there, but it is allowed to become much more anonymous so that the character of the building can now change and evolve with those on the inside. Now, tragically, this building has suffered a tremendous and disastrous fire as they were starting to restore it. And this precipitated certain debates during the restoration process about at what historical stage should they restore the building? Should they preserve it? Should they go back to Sullivan and Adler's original design? Or should they choose a moment that was more indicative of the Black congregation that currently inhabited that space? And what they wanted to do was they wanted to restore it to the state that it existed in when gospel music was actually born in this place. And so this is a really important moment for me, because it's this moment where we get, through the accident of time, the passage of this building to a new community, the potential for us to rethink the canon of Sullivan's ideas. That the real moment of this building coming into its full potential is not when Sullivan designed it and constructed it. It's not even when the Jewish congregation inhabited it themselves, but it's when African Americans can make it their own and really push Sullivan's architecture to become a truly American architecture. One that was not suspicious of the creative potentials of first-generation immigrants and African American subjects, but one that embraced it by creating a kind of dialogue between these two cultures. And so in this kind of analysis, I'm really trying to open up the principles of form that we take from our so-called canonical precedents. And then in that spirit, I'm trying to then extrapolate how it is that we can rethink the role of canonicity in architectural education. So here are just a few principles that I think are implicit in the strategies that I've used to discuss this work. One is that in an anti-racist curriculum, one should found its ideas upon a critique of the whiteness of our discipline and actively attempt to recover the non-white voices and perspectives that were lost to time. That way you have the original core of what used to be the canon, but always understood through a critical lens of its whiteness, its investment in white supremacy. And then in order to divest it of that association, then we need to then recuperate what elements of that white racial discourse were actually able to be operative in these non-white spaces, and which elements had to fall away in order for this, this potential to open itself up. In institutions like professional schools of architecture, the faculty and student body must consist of non-white peoples in positions of authority and instruction. Studio instructors must reject the notion that good design only comes from monumental forms or through technological innovation, the very engines that propel this kind of canonical notion of architecture that is associated and invested in these forms of whiteness that separate the global north from the global south, and that create this myth of genius primarily amongst its white producers. And then lastly, that the history of architecture must consist of a cultural history of the built environment, not just a canon of good or monumental works. And lastly, I want to offer Linda Martine Alkoff's book, The Future of Whiteness, as one potential way forward of rethinking what whiteness could actually mean. So she's engaged in a study in philosophy about what the phenomenology of whiteness involves. And she separates the institutional and abstract or structural characteristics of racism as an ideology from the ways that we learn to repeat our racial identities in real time with our families, our friends, our spouses, and the people that we live with. And so this sort of embodied sense of racial character, she's looking to both critique how it is that we pass on notions of white supremacy, but then how it is that we might actually reform them. And she calls for this notion of trying to reinvent what whiteness means at this lived level in order to both critique and then revise what whiteness means at the institutional level. And so I think that this is a useful model to perhaps experiment with within architectural discourse if we were to think through the ways that our daily practice of who it is that we recommend as precedents in studio, who it is that we recommend as emulations of good design or monumental design. If we change and pluralize that notion, we might be able to also then change the notion of whiteness at a larger level. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I do want to make sure that we have some time to consider questions and to engage in a conversation. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. That was extraordinary, and it was wonderful to get the sense of the work you've accomplished in your book and the case study. I have a couple of questions that I can read from the audience. I have a few of my own, but perhaps I'll keep my own voice in the background for now. And what I'll do is I'll just read some of these questions that are coming from the audience and have you address them. So one question is this. I am particularly interested in how exclusionary were the evolutionist models for defining the architectural canon. They were definitely racist, but they were also extremely misogynist. I wonder what your thoughts are on how we should pursue scholarship on this topic. Is the focus on race only adequate, or should we strive for an intersectional approach that discusses other obvious oppressive forces embedded in our discourse? If we don't address them simultaneously, aren't we perpetuating these other forms of oppression otherwise?
So I do, thank you for this question. It's a very good question. I do think that we have to think intersectionally, particularly as we, if we're following the model that I'm suggesting, the ethos, which is to sort of debate the canon, its current limits, and what it can, what its potential is, what it can open itself up to. And so I do think that these exclusionary and even evolutionist models of development, we need to sort of beware of for what they can become in their most extreme sense. And then I do advocate for an intersectional form of analysis. The only reason I don't do that in this text is to really make a case, a strong case, for the ways that race is endemic to the ways that we understand modern architecture. And that when architects of the 19th and 20th century looked at and analyzed the biological theories of the past and the racial anthropologies of the past, they didn't just see a sort of incidental element of political discourse or contemporary development, but they saw a deep developmental principle that undergirded how mankind as racial groups produces material culture. And a way of really illustrating this is to point us to this moment in Gottfried Semper's treatise, where he shows us an illustration of the Egyptian situla and the Greek hydria. But then he goes on to read those forms for their essential characteristics, the essential characteristics of the people who made them. And so he's producing through analog a kind of racial profiling of the object in the way that we might racially profile a person. And it's really interesting for me to show that race was a formal category for these architects, and that they learned formal principles from them. And that really was the purpose of the book, but not to sort of discount the intersectional modes of analysis, hopefully to open us up to that kind of territory.
And linked to this, another member of the audience is asking whether there is a method, in your view, with which we can systematically check studies of typology, taxonomy, or forms for racist beliefs. And would you say that your work is encouraging a general caution with regard to the format of typology and taxonomy? And perhaps this is a question on which one might sort of hitch one's wagon about, I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about the status of typology actually in studio, the way we think about typology, whether it's a syntax, whether it's a history, and the ways in which those concepts collide and coalesce historically even. So I'll let you.
I'll try and answer it this way. I tend to be suspicious of typologies, building typologies for what it is that they're actually describing to us. But I don't discount their ability to be very powerful tools for the architect, particularly for people of color who would like to formalize some of the informal spatial activities that have yet to be formalized in architecture. So let me illustrate it this way. When I talk about the historical evolution of the shotgun house, and I talk about the ways that we tend to reduce it to the adjacent sequence of certain rooms, a central doorway, a kind of gabled roof, and a porch, and that somehow that captures the cultural essence of the African American experience here. That this is really just a kind of remnant of the grand complexity that was occurring as the shotgun house was evolving. So if you follow John Michael Vlach's work and you start in the Yoruban tribes in Africa, and then you go over to the spaces in Haiti, where on the French plantations where African slaves were put, and you see that they adopt the mortise and tenon joinery of the French, and they put it into their own structures. And then you trace that work through the Haitian Revolution and into the United States. What you see is that, especially when they arrive in the United States, you see that now you have a Black community that is a freed slave community from Haiti, living directly alongside those who are still enslaved in New Orleans, coming from West Africa, as well as living alongside Creole communities that have mixed and amalgamated in New Orleans itself. That's 3 Black communities. They're all going to use these spaces differently. They have different material cultures, they have different ceremonial cultures, but they're able to adjust their lives to these spaces. And as the freed Haitians craftsmen are creating these material forms and building a life for themselves, by that next generation, the shotgun house becomes a mass-produced developer form, which then starts to feed many different low-income communities, both Black and white, which have a completely different way of using space. And so in that sense, if we look at that really closely, that historical evolution, what does the form tell us? It tells us a little bit, but we still need to understand the spatial complexity and map that back into why it is that this form isn't changing. What is it able to accommodate? And so I think that, for me, space and the study of space is a really good check against the architect's the monopoly on form. And particularly if we think about the architect as not needing these phenomena to be translated geometrically into a form that they can then manage and manipulate intellectually, geometrically, autonomously from the phenomena itself. I'm trying to sort of interrupt the ease of that process and to get architects to revisit that space. So I do think that typology is useful, but I think that it's useful when one has a deep knowledge of the culture that they're serving, not a superficial knowledge that comes from a diagram that then you assume has all the elements that are necessary to understand the space.
That's a great answer, and it leads to this from Lawrence Chua. Thank you for your talk. I was struck by the perception of loss that informed many of the views of 19th and early 20th century architects that you highlighted. A perceived loss of traditions, references, or character. This seems consistent not only with the ways white supremacist ideology has historically operated, the fear of the loss of that supremacy, or the fear of quote unquote white culture, the fear of no longer being a dominant majority, etc., but also with the ways the canon in architectural history has operated as a consistent bulwark against that loss. Could you speak to whether you think a canon is still relevant to architectural education today?
So this is a really good question. There are 2 elements to it in my mind. One is this sense of how the canon helps one to recuperate what could be lost to time. So the maintenance and continuities of traditions that one might otherwise not be able to trace and then influence the present. And I think that is true. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we have people from Alan Colquhoun talking about the fact that this notion of vernacular and regionalism and indigeneity didn't really emerge for us until we started losing it and becoming modern and needed to name it and identify it. But then on the other side of that, then if one does not have a canon, and a canon is really just, in this case, I'm thinking of it as a kind of a sensibility for the lineage of ideas that anchor you to a past that allows you to be productive in the present and to project a future. And so in that sense, I think anyone who builds in the present is employing a canon. It just may not be as explicitly outlined as it is in architecture. So on one side, I want to say that we don't need, and we haven't had, quite honestly, for a long time, a single canon of buildings. It's no longer like the École des Beaux-Arts where there's 100 or 150 buildings that you must memorize to understand what the classical world is about. But each institution of architecture generates its canon. And there's a kind of interplay between the figures who teach studio and who teach history and the sense of architecture's future that they legitimize by exchanging certain types of figures and certain types of examples. And that's what I think needs to be changed. So there are probably 150 of those, or however many institutions of architecture there exist in the United States. And then even more when we think about private practice and the ways that people develop these ideas within themselves and within the communities. But what I want is for people to not just use this unconsciously or to reinforce it or to accept it when it is given to them, but to sort of struggle with it and to debate with it. And so, and I think that especially at elite institutions that tend to monopolize the space of cultural production within architecture in terms of our ideas and the theories that we tend to pass on to others, I think that those institutions need to be the most self-critical. And when you actually see that it becomes a space where different types of canons can emerge, as opposed to one that serves hegemonically across the institution, I think then you have a healthier space. And so I would say that in that sense, we want to be proliferating canons as much as possible. But in my mind, that means both critiquing the limits of the previous canon, but also, and this is really important, paying for the recovery and the documentation of those that were written out previously. This is the reparations that must take place in order for any canon process in these institutions to be ethical. Otherwise, they're completely self-serving and internal. And even if they recognize their mistakes, you're not making up for the mistakes that you've made in the past. And so this means not only sort of hiring and welcoming people of color into your spaces, but giving them the resources to be writing their histories and making sure that those histories can be legitimized in the same ways as other histories were. And if I put this really plainly, right, every year we get new books on Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe. Now, nothing against these architects, but we already probably know all that we need to know about them in terms of how we design buildings based on what they thought about architecture. But every time one of those books comes out, we don't have a book on an important African-American architect or an important woman architect or an important whatever kind of architect that we've ignored to continue to buffer and reinforce this European Eurocentric notion of who is important in our discourse. So if we never publish another book on Frank Lloyd Wright or Mies van der Rohe, we'll still know who they are, but we can take that energy and apply it somewhere else that will allow us to now proliferate and pluralize the canons that we need to be working with in the future. And that is an important balancing act. It's not just going back and making Frank Lloyd Wright okay to use today. Talk about, yes, he was a racist, but if we use this and this and this principle from him, it's okay to then use him in our studios. But we also need to be recovering and broadening that discourse. And for me, that's a kind of dialectic that is absolute. You can't have one without the other.
Well said. I will ask the next question here from Gabe Colombo. Do you think that politics, including racial politics, are truly embedded in form? Can we creatively recover, extend, and reinterpret inherited architectural wisdom from a European or other traditions without understanding such formal spatial strategies as inherently oppressive?
So I don't know that I would go so far as to say that these strategies are inherently oppressive, but I will say that these strategies are not neutral or abstract or universal. I think that's the mistake that we made with Enlightenment discourses, and we continue to make in sort of American politics, thinking of Constitution and liberty and democracy in these idealist terms, and not really doing the work that we need to do to understand them in real time, in real terms. And so for me, all of these traditions come from a time and place, they come from a political context, and they bear the index of that context. So in that sense, then the ideas that we received from, for example, the École des Beaux-Arts, which in my mind was a literal experiment in European colonialism. How do you formalize the aesthetic standards of the state, and how can you use that to proliferate this as a universal language around the world as a way of building empire? And that's where we get idea of precedent study. And that's where we get the idea of the master and the students in the studio. So for me, then, I would be really highly suspicious of the forms of sociality and the forms of thinking that come from those practices. In fact, I'll be really rigorous in my critique of them before I would reuse them again. And in that sense, I would say that one needs to have a healthy skepticism towards what they can produce. This is literally would satisfy the ethos that I'm trying to recommend here, which is that you sort of debate with yourself. What are the pros and cons of this? I don't think it's impossible, but I think that it requires broad debate. It requires a broad kind of historical critique and people coming together to understand what those implications are. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it would be very difficult. And it would be very difficult in a world where we don't have racial equality and where architecture is still defined as capital A monumental form that can only be produced with a certain amount of wealth and privilege in our world. I'd be less likely to think that that's definition of architecture is possible than a broader, more horizontal definition of architecture that takes certain ideas that used to be monopolized as monumental forms, but then applied in different contexts. I think that probably helps to democratize and pluralize the practice in a way that just hoping that the European ideas that you love are no longer racist would be in one individual case.
So I'm going to take one last question for you, Charles, which is coming from Brian Norwood. If we see stylistic and racial categories as both rooted in racism, particularly in a kind of biological racism and white supremacy, how do you think about using the language of style in your own historical descriptions? Like Sarah Ahmed begins the phenomenology of whiteness essay you showed on the last slide, how do we address the challenge of thinking critically about whiteness through the language of whiteness?
So I think that's a very good question. Let's see. So I think what Brian is asking me is sort of by repeating the use of the term style and using that as kind of analytical lens, am I sort of repeating the categorical errors of whiteness in the ways that I'm analyzing the work? And what I would say is that I try to actually use certain elements and critical lenses that enable us to critique what whiteness is in order to identify and read it. So in that sense, I don't think that I'm really using whiteness to identify whiteness, but I'm trying to use things like critical race theory, like theories of racial embodiment, these theories that have emerged as correctives to allow us to look back and to see whiteness as a thing, one that is parallel to Blackness and other forms of cultural identities, so that we no longer then make the mistake of either not seeing whiteness or seeing whiteness as normal and sort of universal or invisible. And so in that sense, I feel like I'm not sort of using the lens of whiteness to understand whiteness, but I'm using sort of the corrective lenses that have been placed around whiteness to identify it and then to kind of surgically alter what it is that it does. But I do think that like embedded in the question is a real important point, which is that we don't want to be caught believing that we can undo the works, the legacy of white supremacy with the master's tools. I mean, I don't think that that's always possible. And so you could find yourself in a solipsistic loop where you're always sort of using terms of European or European American architectural discourse to talk about European and European American architectural discourse. And I think that was the problem. And for me, this moment really came into clarity with the Sullivan chapter, where I was able to connect Sullivan's notion of American democracy with a different notion within the Jewish American congregation, and then an even different notion still within the African American congregation. All of them saying they wanted a democratic architecture, all of them saying they wanted to belong to the body politic, all having a different vision of what that was. And so in this comparative terms, I try to sort of guard against the solipsism that happens in other spaces.
Right. And Charles, just in closing, and as a way to thank you for your lecture, I mean, one of the things I did, one of the many things I found remarkable about your book is actually the way you describe, and this is an ekphrasis, and a critical one, what it is to inhabit space. And that is maybe the way to respond. So thank you so much, Charles. That was outstanding. And it was, I think we almost had 200 people here at one point. So it is a real pleasure to hear your words of wisdom. And thank you again for joining us tonight.
Yes, and thank you all for listening and for the invite. Thank you very much.